Thank you all, everyone, for attending today, this session. So this is the second session in a rolling program of reviewing some of the ideas and options for discussion in our current consultation, the Department of Finance's current consultation. A couple of housekeeping issues. We're recording this session, as you know. We'll probably put the slides on our website, depending on the quality of the recording. We have other sessions taking place through to the until mid-October. There's an option here. I think our chat option is maybe, I'm not sure if it's operating, but certainly the Q&A function is working. If you've got any questions or issues that you want to highlight, and some members of our team will have a look at that and maybe field some of them at the end if we have time. That said, today's session is really very hectic, so I'm a little concerned at just fitting it all in, so that might be a struggle. But nonetheless, we'll take a look at any questions you raise or any issues that you raise and see what we can do to come back to you. Our consultation runs until the 15th of November. The documents are available on the link. Usual form, which is to respond via Citizen Space. There are lots of questions, but if you've, they do come in sections, so they can be broken down. I'm hoping that the document is reasonably intelligible. And if you've any queries, you can come back to us at the web address below. So this section in this seminar, or this session, sorry, is focusing on sections 3A and 4A of the documents. That's really the proposals for new buildings, the next step proposals for new buildings as we see them coming through, or what might be likely to happen. So the expectation is to learn, really, to be looking at the other administrations and learning from them and their regulations which came into operation over the course of 2022, and to consider the implications in adopting the new National Calculation Methodology software, so the new SAP 10 and SBEM software that has come about as a result of those developments in GB nations. In very broad terms, the measures in England certainly were intended to go as far as possible, whilst acknowledging that the transition to low carbon heat through technologies such as heat pumps really does need some further development. It's quite a big ask. So they're going as far as possible without absolutely requiring low carbon heat. The new notional buildings in all the regions, therefore, are based, as I understand it, are by and large heated with a gas boiler. There's some exceptions to that. We'll come to the detail there, with offsetting measures equivalent to a significant array, a significant photovoltaic array on the dwelling. In England, for example, this extends to 40% of the roofs of a new dwelling. That said, whilst low carbon is kind of considered a challenge, Scotland has gone ahead and has introduced a ban on direct emissions heating from April 2024. So that would mean you couldn't really combust any fuels in your building from April 2024. So you'd be really pushed towards heat pumps and heat networks in Scotland from April 2024. So we're kind of alert to that. So in terms of new dwellings, I'm expecting that everyone who's attending the seminars has some familiarity with building regulations, so you should be familiar with the notion or the current working practice where you have a target carbon dioxide emission rate. It's based on the modelled assumptions of or model performance of a notional dwelling of the same size and shape as the actual dwelling, but constructed to a very standardized specification. So if you can meet the emissions of the standard building, or the notional dwelling, then you're deemed to have passed that requirement. In addition, then in Northern Ireland, our last uplift in 2022 brought forward manual betterment calculations to improve that. So if you're subject to the NZEB regulation requirements, then you need to bring forward. You need to show and demonstrate a manual betterment of that, and we'll see a little example of that later on. And so the phase 3 uplift that we're looking at will be centred around on dwellings, 2 options then, which would effectively remove the need to do that betterment calculation. And the 2 potential options are for the notional dwelling, or one following kind of England's proposal of a notional dwelling specification based on a gas boiler and photovoltaics. And then the other is looking at what happens if we were to move directly to kind of heat pump led specification, and in that case we haven't put the photovoltaic array on the dwelling, but the heat pump is deemed to have the emissions performance requirements in that case. So those two options are outlined on a table, and you'll see this table if you look in the consultation. And what we have there then are a kind of common set of fabric standards at the top, in the items in white. The black column, the second column across there in black, is an example of a current specification which might meet the current NZ requirement. But the white column here is looking at standardized items for fabric. And then the light green looks at option 1, which is our gas and PV boiler, and the dark green looks at option 2. So those are items where there could be variability or where you have a different specification. Option 2 is really kind of a bit preliminary in that we're trying to, we've issues, we think there would be more issues to try and sort out there. For example, is the heat pump specification absolutely appropriate? Was there a better way to look at it, or a different specification needed? And both options obviously have adopt fabric and other expectations from England specifications. So you've got an improved fabric there. Oh yes, the final thing is just to bear in mind that given that option 1 is based on mains gas, it's likely that increased reliance on heat pumps or moves to heat pumps and other alternatives will be necessary because of the lack of mains gas provision locally. In our previous session, we spoke about the kind of different characteristics between ourselves here and other places. So you're looking at one of those big characteristics being the lack of mains gas provision here. So alternatives there are likely to mean that more and more heat pumps will be kind of rolling out in either scenario. So yes, we've noted here 30% or more of new dwellings here are still being constructed using home heating oil, and that comes traditionally because we've had a Northern Ireland fuel factor, which we've highlighted there in our little equation, alongside the table 2.1 factors. So those table 2.1 factors previously, before the last uplift in England, gave easements on the emissions performance when you were using higher carbon fuels. It kind of covered 50% of the difference, whereas with Northern Ireland adding the extra 1.14, it meant there was no real penalty for using oil. And you could construct an oil-fueled home and a gas-fueled home in Northern Ireland to roughly or to broadly the same kind of standards. So both our options, if I just go back, in option 1 and in option 2, a really significant thing that we're looking to do is to remove those fuel factors. So those easement factors have gone in the other regions there in the last uplift, and that's a really significant thing to be happening here. It's going to be quite an ask, because it means that the emissions performance really will have to match or outperform that of the notional dwelling specification. So we've modelled a semi-detached house as a kind of good interim. It's not detached and it's not a flat and it's not a terrace. It's kind of got a reasonable amount of fabric. So to try and see how these kind of things might look or how they would work out. Capital costs haven't really been looked at yet. So we'll be interested in anything that's offered there, but or any feedback there. But assessments by of similar kind of options by the Scottish Government in 2020-21 tended to suggest that there was a net benefit to society of £46 million, whereas there was a net cost of 250 million in moving to the kind of heat pump led option, similar to option 2. So we're not all. That's why we're a bit reticent about just going straight ahead, I suppose, with option 2 and going for the heat pump led specification. And views are sought on the viability and any refinements that we could maybe make on that to see where that might be a better way to progress. So just touching on it quickly, what we have in Annex B in Table B1 is 8 scenarios which we outline. So scenario 1 is our typical existing build. Scenario 2 are what's currently compliant with Part F. Scenario 2 is if you use gas. Scenario 3 is if you use oil. Scenario 4 is our mains gas and photovoltaic follow England approach. Scenario 5 is a heat pump led approach. Scenarios 6, 7 and 8 are alternative specifications. The light green ones would meet option 1. The dark green one, scenario 8, would meet any of the options because it's a really very high specification. The SAP ratings that come from SAP 10 are there, and they're based on SAP 10's estimated its costs, which are themselves kind of out of date because they were developed back in 2019, just before the Ukraine crisis and things, and the cost of living crisis. So those fixed prices really aren't altogether as accurate, and in generating the ratings, they're not really very accurate ratings because of the relative fluctuations between the fuel prices. So there's an issue there that we'll look at separately, but the local running costs for the regulated uses are perhaps more reflective. And then our bottom column, or our bottom row, has assigned the local running costs when you add unregulated uses, so that there's an allowance there of 2,400 kilowatt hours of unregulated electricity use for appliances and things that aren't within the SAP assessment, but that gives a better reflection on people's bills. And I suppose the key characteristic is that the bottom line on scenario 4 and scenario 5 is something like a £600 running cost difference. And that's principally because scenario 5 doesn't have photovoltaics, and because the photovoltaics are quite the price you get for exporting electricity and the price you get for consuming electricity from the photovoltaics is quite good, whereas the cost of importing electricity to run a heat pump is quite expensive. So that's why there's differences and subtleties there. Scenario 6 and scenario 7 are alternatives to the optional 1 specification. So they're looking at other fuels in a main, perhaps in an off-gas area that could be used. And that they tend to require, because you're using LPG, which has a higher, I think it is higher emissions, and HVO, which is the hydro-treated vegetable oil liquid biofuel, it has higher primary energy, that they tend to mean that we need a higher amount or better and an improved fabric in order to meet the requirement. And those are the running cost outcomes that come with that. And then the final scenario is really more something that we were looking at with an intention of phase 4 or phase 5. This document that we're talking about today is phase 2. Our next uplift will be phase 3. So the phase 4 or phase 5 would be 26, 27, or possibly later, but hopefully 26, 27 would be looking at a standard of home more in line with scenario 8. But it shows the impact of adding photovoltaics and the improved fabric and everything, throwing everything at it, really. So alongside, so we'd be interested, sorry, in your opinions on all of this and how that might work out, or where that goes, or whether there's any kind of really strong preference for option 1 or option 2. And the emissions impact on this we'll look at a wee bit later in this seminar. In terms of metrics, these are quite important. The reason that we've selected those 8 scenarios is really, or the certainly scenario 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is because often quite informed by these metrics. So the new metrics that will be required, or the suite of metrics following what has occurred in England and the other regions. One is the emissions metric. That's the current metric, and we're all aware of that and how that works. And of course, I've noted again, we wouldn't need the current manual ANZ 40% betterment check or 25% betterment check for flats. And then for the primary energy is a new metric which would come in, and a fabric energy efficiency assessment is proposed as a new metric to be assessed. And in reality, the actual dwelling, your design, would need to match or better these metrics, and they're all derived based on the performance in the fabric, in the case of fees, the fabric performance of the notional dwelling. So there are, of course, backstops to this. There's limiting U value values and air tightness standards, and then there's limiting services efficiencies. But the general intention is to make sure and bring in some metrics that look at energy. That would be the fees and the primary energy, and rather than just carbon, because as the electricity grid decarbonizes, I mean, if you ultimately had a carbon-free electricity grid, you could heat your dwelling with direct electricity, and there would be no restriction on that or problem with that, even though that direct electricity might be, you know, terribly expensive or not very efficient because of the way that you've because you're not really measuring energy if you're only measuring emissions. So these new metrics look at energy. Primary energy, just for people's own knowledge, is really considering the additional energy factors involved in extracting and bringing the fuel to the dwelling and getting it there and getting it all kind of organized. And we look at some of the values that are applied to that. Our discussion document looks at other potential metrics that could have been used or could be used. One is costs, i.e. the SAP rating. Another one is just the sheer energy use as opposed to the energy, the primary energy. And another one is a renewable energy ratio, so that you look at how much renewables are there. We're trying to, in taking the 5 that we have above, we're trying to get a right balance between not having so many tests and things to do with reasonably complete and assuring you don't get some kind of strange outcome or incentive to do something that's unwise. So it's trying to get balance and holistic assessment whilst minimizing the burdens on the assessment. So at the center of all of this, as you know, SAP calculates the kilowatt hours of each fuel that might be needed, and it takes away the kilowatt hours of the energy that might be generated and used in the building or generated and exported. And then it converts the energy requirements into emissions or into primary energy. And the key kind of nub or hub of that is table 12 in SAP. And if you take a little minute to look at the primary energy factors in that and the emission factors in that, you find it starts to inform you about the viability of fuels or how they compare. So if you run with option 1, you see that mains gas has an emissions factor of 0.21, so 210 grams of carbon dioxide for every kilowatt hour of mains gas that's burnt, and a primary energy factor of 1.13. So you have to kind of assess how do other fuels compare against that to see how viable those fuels might be, and as you look at things. So you find there that biogas, for example, on the primary energy metric is really, you know, reasonably significant, 10% or so, more onerous than gas, and that proves to be significant when you do and actually model these things out and assess that. Liquid biofuels similarly are higher, but not quite as high. They're about 5%. So they're a little bit, you know, it might be possible if you've improved the fabric or if you've done additional renewables, or if you've done something else, it might be possible to sort of use those. Oil has significantly higher emissions than gas, as we know. So you know, something like 40% higher emissions. So in that circumstance, oil, and this is the big thing, when we remove the fuel factors, oil, certainly conventional oil boilers really wouldn't be viable under any of the options in the next uplift. And that's a likely outcome. Now, I'm sure there are always circumstances where someone could somehow get it to work if they did enough other things, but in common practice, it would be difficult to see how oil would be viable. Possibly, if it were used in a very sophisticated or specific kind of hybrid scenario, and only a very little amount of oil was used, perhaps at peak times when the electricity supply was struggling or something like that. There's always potentials, but in general terms, a standard condensing or oil boiler isn't something we expect to see in future developments. We also see wood pellets being quite significantly affected, which we think is significant due to the primary energy factor. And similarly, direct electricity is significantly impacted. That said, if you have very low overall kilowatt hour demand, there are exclusions around that, and there's potential where if you had a very, very low demand building, a direct electric heating solution might be possible. And the other thing to bear in mind is that whilst the primary energy factor for electricity is 1.5, if you have a heat pump perhaps operating at 300% efficiency, the effective primary energy factor for each kilowatt hour of heat that is delivered will be a third of that. So it's really not 0.5. So if you kind of think that the emissions factors and the primary energy factor for standard tariff electricity are reduced by a third once we move to option 2, because you've set targets on the basis of a highly efficient heat pump, or if not a third, they're divided by 2.5. Then you find you've got really very low emissions and very low primary energy targets to meet under option 2, and that makes other fuels really quite difficult to use unless they're somehow allied with a hybrid heat pump, as we've suggested. So we've kind of outlined that in a fuel viability table. This is our best estimate based on the semi-detached modelling. You could find, for example, that some of these scenarios don't work because there isn't the same scope for improvement. For example, if you improve the fabric in a small mid-floor flat, it may not have the same benefit as having improved the fabric on our semi-detached house that we've modelled. But this is our estimate as to how we find some of the fuels viable. So we'd encourage you to look at that perhaps in some more detail, because having backup options or alternatives or other scenarios might be important when you've got a grid to think about, when you've got other things going on that might be operating beyond strictly building regulations. Very important comment at the bottom there, which is we really are under pressure. We're expecting that there will be a lot of pressure to ensure that heat networks remain viable under all policy options. And a mechanism has been developed, which we'll talk about under the option 1 notional building, as to how to attend to that, because England have been through it all. It would require us to develop our own approach. If we were to take on option 2, we would have to develop another technique or find another solution or work out some other guidance and difficulty. So there's quite a policy hurdle in trying to ensure, if you went to the very low emissions and very good primary energy performance that the heat pump building notional dwelling would set, you would have to have a completely different policy for connecting to heat networks if they were to be viable, because they simply wouldn't be able to meet those requirements from our understanding, or at least conventional district heat networks may not always be able to do that. And you don't want to make heat networks, which always have the possibility of future decarbonisation under other legislation, you don't want to make them unviable because you built a whole load of new houses and they weren't allowed to connect to it. So the second metric then, that was kind of discussing primary energy and emissions, but the other metric that's important here is fees. It should probably be called proposed new metric 3 there, really, but it's the second new metric. It's the third metric. And that is really trying to encourage a fabric first approach. I expect a lot of you might be familiar with it from England, but it's alongside or in addition to the limiting U values, and its intention is to ensure that the energy demand is low. And it's really a bit of an holistic assessment of the fabric aspects of the specification. So that's the insulation U values, the thermal bridging, and the air tightness, and it makes general assumptions about everything else and models the two buildings that you model your performance against the overall fabric performance on that. So in theory, you can improve your thermal to any one aspect. You could, for example, improve your thermal bridging, and that might allow you to have a slightly worse air tightness, or it might allow you slightly worse U values than the notional dwelling. So, I mean, England has been requiring this since 2014, but not at anything like the onerous level that would be applied here. The previous standard had higher U values assumptions, and it had a 15% tolerance. That all goes. You would have to effectively kind of match the performance. So if we zoom in, these are the kind of U values you would really almost certainly have to build to, unless you can obtain some kind of room for maneuver on your thermal bridging and beat the assumption in it, or on your air tightness, which I think probably would happen, but it may not give you as a huge scope for relaxation of your U values. You might be able to beat the 5 that's assumed in the notional dwelling specification, but it could be difficult to do much more. At least that's our kind of finding. But again, we're open to hear how is it working in England. Are people finding these U values are actually being achieved? That's the kind of information we'd be keen to hear. The document goes into a bit more detail because Wales and Scotland don't have a fees approach. They simply go with higher limiting U values, which sounds a bit more straightforward and simple, but we're concerned it doesn't give enough, or we think it would be better. Fees is better because it gives more incentive and encouragement to explore the thermal bridging and air tightness, but thermal bridging in particular. And so their U values are there, their backstop or their limiting U values are there, and the other important consideration in this is something that we've spoken about in our last uplift, which is it's important to consider whether it's elemental, so whether it's really, really strict. So for example, on this table, Wales have a value of 0.18 for their as the limiting U value for their external walls, and that is it. You can have one wall that's worse, but all your walls on average have to have that 0.18 when they're averaged out. Whereas in Scotland, there's a lower U value of 0.17 for walls, but it allows whole building offsets. So you could have a much higher, better value in your roof than is required, and that will allow you to compensate. And that whole building approach is currently in place in our Northern Ireland standards and is currently in place in the Republic. So just to come back, if we adopt the way the limiting values that are there in England, they would be they would be reverting to pure elemental approach rather than allowing a whole building assessment. But for the fees assessment, there is a whole building approach because it's the overall model that gets looked at. So that's what I think we talk about in this slide. Yes, so the fees regulation and guidance is really why we think that would be this principal determining factor in new dwellings, certainly, rather than these limiting values. We think that and we think that these will be quite challenging for industry. So yes, so there are different notional dwelling values for Wales and Scotland and the Republic of Ireland's notional dwelling. But again, as we've said before, we're not entirely sure without fees whether whilst the numbers appear lower, are they actually being achieved, or would they actually have to be achieved in practice if you don't have this fees requirement? Is this level of performance actually being achieved in practice on that notional building, albeit it is setting a higher or a tough emissions target. So that's what it comes down to really is the expectation around photovoltaics and whether there would be room for more photovoltaics or other renewables, which would allow an easement on these outcomes in Wales and in Scotland. But in England, you would really have to achieve these U values or the same overall fabric performance through the fees requirement. So yes, and these are the indicative future values that have been offered in previous future home statements from England, which are worth bearing in mind. So that's the scope for kind of further improvement, perhaps. So one other metric that was discussed and is used by Wales is a SAP EPC rating, or it's the EER, the energy efficiency rating, which really relates to the relative running cost of the home. And we're concerned about using that because of the fuel price fluctuations that can occur. And already I think SAP 10 is showing that and the differences between the cost assumptions in it and the reality. that we looked at previously are indicative of difficulties in using such a metric. Another one that was called for by various kind of groups and we can see a lot of sense in is the energy use intensity. So that's looking at the pure kilowatt hours of each fuel and adding that up so you have a total kilowatt hour. But the difficulty with it is it doesn't altogether just help you discriminate between kind of assign a weighting or a value to any particular to that. So electricity is a kilowatt hour, gas is a kilowatt hour, yet electricity is really expensive, and yet gas is really high carbon. So that so the weighting around that maybe is a bit of an issue. The fifth alternative metric that we looked at was renewable energy ratios. So that was that's a procedure in the Republic that where I think it's 20% of the primary energy use of the building should be able to be demonstrated to be having been delivered from renewable sources. And the overall conclusion when this has been looked at in the past by other administrations that is generally that the metrics that we're proposing, we think, provide a sufficiently robust kind of set of new targets that you're going to have a substantial renewable proportion in your dwelling, be that you're using a heat pump or be that you're using photovoltaic arrays or some other renewable technology, then we think that effectively a very high renewable energy proportion is going to be needed in any case with the notional dwellings that have been put forward. We have a section which asks a question about block averaging. So this is where if you have perhaps a block of flats or a row of terraces, if the average TER, an emissions rating, or the average TPER beats the, if you average that out across the block, that's kind of acceptable. We have a little kind of residual concern, but we've no real evidence, to be fair, that perhaps glass box penthouse apartments or end terraces or some buildings might be more adversely impacted by that compared to their mid-terrace or mid-flat equivalents. So we're just always mindful as to whether there should perhaps be some kind of limit to the extent of variance from the average that should be permissible for that. So, or whether each individual dwelling in its own right absolutely must meet the relevant targets. So we've asked a question around that. Air tightness we've looked at, and the current regulations do still allow us in Northern Ireland for sample testing on multi-dwelling sites. We think is still possible, albeit subject to a penalty. But England's latest measures really just require all new dwellings to be tested. They set a maximum permissible air permeability level of 8, which is a bit of a reduction from 10. They adjust the assessment so that the values are rounded because it's kind of spurious accuracy to think that 0.78 or something is there. They're all rounded to the nearest 0.5. So you have a value of 0.5 or 1 or 1.5 or 2 or whatever. They allow a new pulse method to come into play, which is a lower pressure test at 4 pascals, and then they convert that to the 50 pascal assessment. So there's a mechanism for that. And then a final thing, which actually we forgot to include perhaps or didn't emphasize sufficiently in the consultation, but all the tests, even failures, have to be recorded and reported to building control. That's an expectation of the assessment. So that should help building control alert if they're seeing a sort of chain of problems there. The final thing to be aware of, and this is an interaction that we'll talk about in another session on ventilation, but there's a limit to a naturally ventilated building. So a naturally ventilated building must have an air permeability of 3 or more. There are concerns that if you don't have that level of inadvertent leakage, I suppose, or then you or air permeable gaps within the construction, then there seem to be risks emerging around natural ventilation. So that's a kind of limit or a cutoff point for if you want a naturally ventilated building solution. If you have a fully mechanical solution, you can keep going to air tightness levels below 3. But it does need to be adequately designed. We ask the question about the new limit that England have of 8. We'd be interested in views as to whether this could be reduced. Our statistics would suggest that 8 would affect very, very, very few buildings. From a while ago, it was fewer than 1% of dwellings would be impacted by the cutoff at 8 of new dwellings. And so we thought that setting the level at 6 or at 5 from the 2020 test results looked at affecting more buildings. We're trying to look at where the appropriate level is, but we're mindful that as you push that limit down, you're pushing more buildings perhaps towards mechanical ventilation solutions. So we're trying to get the balance right and where we go with that, and we'll be interested in opinions on that. And the final thing then is that the changes to England's guidance also emphasise the need to ensure air gaps at insulated junctions are eliminated. So you have to be very careful that your insulated panels, if they're cracks and gaps, are sealed. So we have an issue as well that's discussed here on carbon intensity. SAP 10 suggests that UK electricity has an average annualized carbon intensity of 0.136 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. It does vary monthly, and that's explored within SAP. Obviously, that's much lower than gas and oil, but the reality out there is that different parts of the UK's electrical network can vary substantially from the SAP averages, and in Northern Ireland, our grid intensity is actually quite high and actually higher than gas and oil. So it's up at 0.3, it's 340 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour has been the recent sort of level. Now it is coming down, but because we don't have nuclear and because we burn more coal, our carbon intensity here is not as good as the UK average, despite having higher percentage of renewables contributing. But that is a current state of play. It's not the direction of travel, and it's not, whilst our buildings built today like that are facing that for day one, over their lifetime, that ought not to be the case. They ought to come down towards the kind of SAP levels, or even better than that, as the grid decarbonizes. So we think that that's an interesting thing to kind of note. We talk about how in the value that's been adopted in the Republic, which is a somewhat forward-looking projection, and it's a single electricity market after all. And the benefits in terms of carbon for each of the options are displayed on a table, which we'll come to, and how that all kind of feeds through. And section 6A talks about this in more detail in terms of long-term considerations and about what we do about that. But for phase 3, we're really thinking we'd have to adopt SAP 10. We don't really see much scope for implementing local specific carbon factors for different fuels, certainly for phase 3. So just coming back, if you look at the table for our 8 scenarios which we explored, SAP is really only interested in the regulated emissions. That's the emissions used for heating, cooling, ventilation, lighting, and the auxiliary power associated with that. But it's not looking at your appliances. Goodness knows what happens if you plug in an electric vehicle, for example. So it's not looking at any of those things, but we've made a modest allowance of 2,400 kilowatt hours, again, for those sort of uses in our blue columns here for the total. So what you find is that, interestingly enough, if you follow the SAP 10 column across to scenario 4 and scenario 5, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I'm looking at the scenario 4. SAP 10 has a regulated output of 1,000. That would be 1,000 grams, or sorry, 1,000 kilos of carbon dioxide a year, versus the heat pump led solution, which would have 300 388 or 390, let's say, kilograms of carbon dioxide a year. But actually, if you apply the Northern Ireland fuel factors to this, because our solution in scenario 4 has lots of photovoltaics, it's contributing back and benefiting at a rate of 340 grams rather than benefiting at a rate of 136 grams for every kilowatt hour of electricity the PV array generates. So its outcome on day one, at least, is certainly actually proves to be better than the heat pump led solution on day one, which has a kind of 970 grams, and that's because the electricity the heat pump is consuming is produced, via Kilroot or without the nuclear and in a less decarbonised scenario than SAP 10 has presumed. And the DAP value, I suppose, gives a kind of intermediate or interim sort of position. So that's an interesting little table for people to look at. There are issues about rural impacts on heat pumps. So if we're off the gas grid and you're finding people have to use a heat pump, and they're not able to use mains gas, is that having an adverse rural impact? Nonetheless, we kind of think that phasing out the installation of fossil fuel heatings and homes off the gas grid has been, long proposed a heat pump led approach, but that's all explored in more detail in the consultation. And if that were to be a really significant issue, if it's not fair to have that, if that's deemed as unreasonable in rural areas, that they're not able to avail of the same, or if their costs or construction, or if they're not able to avail of the same benefits as emerge under option, then quite profound things need to be done, which are going to delay our programme. So they're going to be looking at some kind of reintroduction of fuel factors, a bit like we already have, so that oil could maybe be used or something, or other lower cost options would still be available. Or the other thing is to move towards option 2, which is to be kind of equally harsh and require heat pumps everywhere, and that's the only kind of solution, or the only realistic solution, i.e. adopt option 2 for both kind of scenarios. But that's the issue that's explored in that section. There's a section on biofuels. I'm conscious of time here, so I need to keep moving. But liquid biofuels appear just about viable from our analysis of the semi-detached home. And there's people might have issues around the use of biofuels. There's a running cost implication. If you look at that particular cost on that slide, on that chart, you would find that it was fairly significantly expensive. But it would pass the building regulations unless we introduce the cost assessment. Yeah, we also wonder about just avoiding a home that's fitted with a liquid biofuel boiler and risks of that maybe inadvertently or illicitly being reconverted back to burn conventional kerosene without anyone really particularly taking much notice of it. So we've kind of a bit of an issue there. We've an issue as well, or there's an aspect of this that we need to draw attention to, and it's explored in the document, which is about export and non-export connections. So the current assessment will assume that all the energy that could be generated by the photovoltaic on the roof of a dwelling will be used. It'll either be used within the dwelling or it will be exported. It could be that in Northern Ireland you have a higher degree of non-export connections because the grid can't take that export. And once SAP 10 were to become the new assessment, that exported electricity wouldn't, or that which no longer can be exported, i.e. it's curtailed, it's not generated, the system switches off to prevent that. So that exported electricity would not be contributing to your assessment and giving you any benefit under the building regulations any longer. So you could lose perhaps 30, 40, 50% of the benefit of your PV, don't have that ability to export. Or you could be, the answers to that might be because there's a new beta factor, a new self-use aspect to the calculation within SAP 10. and that would mean that by adopting battery storage or by hot water diverters or something like that, you could maybe improve the extent of self-use, and that would avoid your issue. The amount of photovoltaics is just another issue, given that 40% of the roof is the expectation. Well, the current G98 limit for a single phase connection is 3.68 kilowatts. So basically, if your footprint or the plan area of your roof is greater than 59 square meters, you start to get over that threshold. Now, that might not be an issue if 3-phase connections to homes is the standard way forward, and NIE is kind of consulting and looking and taking that forward. So, and the utility regulator might look at that as well. So that would perhaps not be such an issue in that circumstance, but it could be an issue in single phase connections. And renewable energy generation technology, yeah, we're back to this issue about that it's not being included at the minute under option 2 specification, but it could be a helpful additional factor in controlling running costs. So that's outlined in scenario 8 in Annex B. Really important, and this is a move to low temperature heating systems. So this is a kind of change in the design expectations for all new heating systems, and that also applies when they're installed in existing buildings. So the new measures from England and elsewhere require that new wet heating systems should be designed for a flow temperature of no greater than 55 degrees centigrade. So these low temperature systems need bigger pipework, bigger radiators, and if you go lower in temperature, they need even bigger radiators. And it means that condensing boilers can operate more effectively, but it also facilitates any future retrofit to low carbon heating, or would help work with a heat pump. In fact, heat pumps probably would work better at even slightly lower than 55, possibly at 45. And so it would apply where a new system is installed in a new build or in a replacement system. Some stakeholders have suggested it should be 45, but there's a balance there, particularly in relation to installations in existing dwellings, because the size of the radiators in that could be really quite an issue if the fabric isn't of the level that we're talking about in new builds. And it doesn't necessarily, the other important consideration is that there hasn't been introduced, there was no introduction in England to require hot water storage tanks as part of the work, or even space for hot water storage tanks as part of the new dwelling installation. So we're kind of interested in that as to whether maybe a requirement for potential future hot water tank if you have a combi boiler installation at the minute. So we're trying to future-proof for potential direction of travel, but we appreciate that that's a lower area, that's expensive to build, so that has to get the balance right, and England certainly didn't include it. Obviously, there's an uplift in the efficiency of services. We've also got an issue about compliance with the EU's eco-design requirements, which we're required to maintain under the EU protocol. So if there's divergence there going forward with GB, that's an issue we're alert to. There's a question. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Yeah, okay. Sorry,
Yes.
I seem to drop out there. Did you hear on efficiency of services?
Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. So in terms, there's a new technique or a new addition is calculations on water efficiency. So I think England's approved document G outlines 2 methods, a kind of fittings-based approach or a whole building calculator. And if you can achieve that and demonstrate 125 litres per person per day, you get the associated heat benefits of that in your SAP assessment. Sorry, and the expectation is that we would then incorporate that guidance and allow that to be used, even though we don't regulate for water efficiency, that energy benefit from it would be part of our assessment. In terms of heat networks, a bit of background, because I know they're not really terribly common at the minute in locally. There's not a lot to draw upon, but the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, suggesting it could support 20% of the heating requirements for buildings in the UK, and there are documents in Ireland suggesting it could be up to 50%. So maintaining and some of the new technologies and that are coming forward, seem to be offer good prospects with geothermal and combining with waste heat and things from other buildings, which otherwise can't really be used. So it's not really assessing and dealing with heat networks isn't really particularly straightforward. So we're open to receive insight on this if there's anything, and we're working with our DFE, Department for the Economy colleagues on this. But if you go with option 1 in England, if you're connecting to a new network, you're basically expected that the new network will conform, will work as well, or will have the same characteristics, no worse than gas, or if they are worse, you'd have to compensate somehow. So in terms of primary energy and in terms of carbon performance, so we can see how that works, but that's if you're building a new heat network. If you're connecting a new building to an existing heat network, you're allowed to use the existing heat network's characteristics, and you swap the gas boiler. The software will swap the gas boiler's characteristics out and put the heat network characteristics in, so that the system can work. Now, we're not clear how this could all work when we move, if we were to go in and progress with option 2, because we think it's very difficult to see how any heat network could match the performance of the heat pump for under option 2. So there would be quite a bit of policy work and software development and outworking to do to try and make sure that was viable if we went with option 2. Just to note that that whilst you can connect to any existing heat network, there is a limit to that, which is 350 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, and we think when efficiencies and things are kind of taken into account, basically a gas network would be acceptable, but an oil-based network probably wouldn't. So I think we've talked about that, but we'd be interested in if anyone has anything to say about that. We'd be interested to hear on how these systems and things have been working under England's uplift, or if anyone has any experience of that, just to make sure that we're operable here. So I'm aware of time again. So we've questions about low carbon heating and whether there's a specification in approved document L1, which we initially tried to draw upon, but we've had to adjust it slightly to get systems that actually kind of work. So we'll be trying to take that up and see if anyone has any advice on the heat pump specification that's proposed in option 2. And that's, again, more policy work that would be needed and likely to delay things if option 2 were to be the method taken forward. I think most people will be able to appreciate the benefits or the pros in supporting a heat pump-led solution. Obviously, if we were to require a new build, a significant issue is that it would help people prepare and get ready and skill up for installations in existing dwellings, which is where the real market is kind of going on this, or where the real need for reform is needed. And obviously, heat pumps have been rolled out at a fairly significant scale in the Republic of Ireland with their renewable energy requirements and things, and heat pumps fulfilling that requirement quite straightforwardly, and because their EPC metric has a BER and things like that. But we still have this issue. We have a list of cons here, but we have an issue about capital costs. We have an issue about the grid network capacity. We're not sure about, or we'd want to try and be sure. We would want to try and be more sure about. You've also got issues about how would the gas network function and what would the impact of that be on the gas network and on gas policy. And of course, we've got the running costs and a consideration of heat pump networks and or heat networks that we've discussed. Final point in option 2, which I think is significant, is we're not yet clear if homes where mechanical cooling is required. So if our new overheating requirements, which will be discussed in another session, were to require flats, really the only way that a flat or a home could be built perhaps if it was in a noisy or a polluted area and couldn't use natural ventilation or whatever, the only way that it could successfully cool is having tried all passive measures was with air conditioning. Would that mean that with such onerous targets having been established by the heat pump, would that mean that that flat wasn't really viable to construct? So that's another issue that we think needs to be kind of thought through if you were to go with the heat pump led approach. And it's all really coming back to this issue that our resource and our department management is really geared for trying to look and learn from other places and follow England or follow another territory, as opposed to developing a kind of its own approach. So on the likes of this, so it's that endeavour, I suppose, or ambition is relevant. So we talk about the viability and the risks associated with these options. We look for your input on that. Some kind of notification issues. There's two. One is about as-built information and having a home user guide. So a new home user guide is needed. We've provided the link to that. And you can download the link that applies in England and see their document there. And we're expecting that we would kind of follow suit. If anyone's anything to comment on that, or they think that that's unwise or unnecessary, or they think that the substantive comments to make on that, we'd certainly take that evidence in. And then the other thing is that geolocated construction photographs and evidence of construction would start to be required, and the mechanisms for that seem to be built with the accreditation schemes that would be the only people able to access the software to make the lodgements and things. So these things start to be required to try and improve and minimise the design versus as-built gap, and to provide a surety of construction and compliance. So as I say, we've modelled some preliminary outcomes, and they're all there to be picked over a little bit more. But I suppose we have to emphasise they're based on a restricted scenario. So that's our typical 104 square metre new build semi-detached dwelling. Do need to be careful. For example, as I've said here, in scenario 6 and 7, improving the fabric meant that LPG and HVO were potentially viable against option 1, but that might not be the case if you have very little fabric, if you have a mid-floor single aspect flat, for example. So it's not the case that these will always be viable solutions against option 1, and maybe in hindsight, that could be that. Well, it is clarified in the notes below, but that's where the that's the thinking there. Just a bit of a note of caution on that. And we've commented before, but we do talk about potential improvements. So we see 3 potential ways that you could maybe improve or help deal with this running cost issue on option 2. 1 is obviously to use a more efficient heat pump. 2 would be to improve the building fabric, and 3 is to add renewables. But adding the 40% photovoltaic and improving the fabric did this, and we're interested in whether there's a more appropriate heat pump specification. Although what we used we felt was pretty mid-range as it was, or and so that's we're not sure of where that might go. It's interesting, isn't it, as well, to just note the current our assumptions on the pricing that were this. I think they were based from prices back in April, but the there's not a huge change in the uplift because you've had to move from oil to gas. Although you've saved lots of kilowatt hours, that they're being charged at a higher gas price. So you're moving from £878 for oil to £873 for gas. So dropping oil is by abandoning fuel factors is really quite a significant issue. Similarly, we've discussed emissions and that before, and these various carbon factors. So if we could draw a breath for 1 second, I'm going to be even more speedy on proposals for new buildings other than dwellings, and hope that we can get to get through this. In general terms, they whilst you have a more complicated buildings a wider variety of buildings. Cooling could be the significant issue. So our intention in this section is very much to kind of follow England, really, to be honest. We do discuss the differences in the other nations where we can, and where a sort of direct comparison can be made. But the overall kind of direction of travel is, that if we were to invest any of our local resource on anything, it will be on the dwelling side. So we'd expect really to be taking a more follow England, or follow England but learn from other places approach to the non-domestic side. Despite all the complexities in that, obviously Part F assessments follow the same basic principles: modelling against a notional building, limiting FIBRIC standards, limiting services efficiencies. In this case, it also includes limiting unwanted solar gains, because the overheating assessment, I should have maybe said at the last section there, the overheating assessment is no longer within SAP. It becomes a separate exercise, a separate building regulations part. So limiting the unwanted solar gains is still kind of inherent in the non-domestic assessment. You'll probably all know, if you deal with non-domestic buildings, there are two basic specifications: one for kind of side-lit conventional construction, one for top-lit metal construction, usually kind of tin sheds, things like that, warehouses, industrial units. There might be a wider range of notional building types and future uplifts. We're keeping an eye on that, or we'll see what emerges. And the big new kind of change is that England, although Wales has always applied it, but England and Wales have applied a primary energy target alongside the emissions assessment. So we would expect to follow that general approach, and we're really interested to hear if anyone has any experience in that and working with the system in any of the regions, if there are any kind of showstopper issues that they would see impacting here. We go into detail in an annex on the comparisons. So for example, as an example here, this looks at the notional buildings fabric value assumptions. And it's interesting, isn't it, that some of the values in Wales are actually a little bit lower, but some of the G values for the glazing are different as well. So England seems to have uplifted the glazing requirement with a view to prevention of overheating being more of a problem. So that's all explored within Annex D. You're welcome to review that. But the key thing, one of the key things, of course, again, is the notional buildings fuel assumptions. So it's a similar effect to the removal of fuel factors. The old NCM, the current NCM that still applies here, is that whatever fuel you're using in your actual building is applied to the notional building. So if you're using oil, you're assessed against oil. If you're using LPG, you're assessed against LPG, and there's no real penalty for having done that, despite this notion that you're developing an emissions assessment. That target changes depending on the fuel you use. And so Table 7 in the NCM modelling guide outlines the proposals in each of the regions. England has changed it so that really it's comparing to gas in the vast majority of situations, and then for fuels with a carbon factor better than gas, it has relevant specifications closer to the fuel that's used. Wales has gone for gas throughout, and Scotland has gone generally for gas, but with the exception of a particular treatment for heat pumps. So that's all explored in Annex D. And so this is the kind of the table for England. So generally speaking, if I'm not mistaken, if you're natural gas, LPG, fuel oil, manufactured smokeless coal, coal or anthracite, you're compared to natural gas. If you're using waste heat, you're compared to waste heat, but with an efficiency of 63%. So there's a generosity applied in that way. If you're using a heat pump, you're compared to a grid electricity with a heat pump with an efficiency of 264%. So these things, we think, having reviewed it, that the English approach is in keeping, or more straightforward, and would be the one that would be most relevant. So that's what we've kind of proposed. But you're welcome to look at the other regions, or if there's anything relevant there. Heat networks. England has proposed the. An important thing there, first of all, is that the one important aspect of this is that biofuels aren't restricted in the same way then, because you're comparing. If you use a biofuel, you're comparing to a biofuel. So on the non-domestic side, whilst we saw impacts for potentially for wood pellets and things, we wouldn't see the same impacts on the non-domestic side. So that was an important aspect. Similarly, heat networks, the same general principle was expected to apply as in the domestic assessment. So you could connect with a new heat network was expected to perform, and you'd be compared to a gas building, I think, whereas if you were connecting to an existing, you could use its characteristics. Sorry, where a heat network is new, the notional building will use this figure for its emission factor, which isn't too far from gas. It's a bit more generous. Whereas in Scotland and England and Wales, sorry, they compare absolutely to gas. So the pipework distribution losses and things could be harder for heat networks if you fall under the Welsh and Scottish regime. Could be harder to achieve. In all administrations, hot water's been reformed. So there's been changes in the background about assumptions about hot water use. Classifies buildings into, or activities, sorry, into high or low water demand. So schools, for example, I think have different assumptions about the hot water use. So that applies in all regions. So we'd expect that would be adopted. There are changes in terms of lighting and auxiliary power, but they're similar in all the nations, and there's nothing there that we see as too extraordinary. One of the significant differences across the regions is the notional building assumptions about how much photovoltaic is applied. So England have based it again based on the foundation area, i.e. the roof plan area. Wales sets an expectation based on the gross floor area, and Scotland uses the same approach, but has a higher level of application, but a lower maximum amount. So that's all up for discussion as to where that would go. But our expectation would have been that one would follow England on it, unless someone is coming back to us telling us that that's really not deliverable here. Perhaps our grid isn't suitable for it, or there's particular issues. So that's why we've put the consultation out to try and hear that feedback, if there is any. And these variabilities, so we wonder sometimes if this is the key thing that determines why Scotland argues it achieved an X percentage uplift or whatever, whether when it looks at all its building types, these differences can somehow apply that. But obviously basing it on gross floor area becomes a problem if you have a tall multi-storey building, because you may not have enough roof to put that amount of photovoltaics on. So that's why they've got these percentage area maximum limits. In all regions, the PV arrays are expected to be provided facing south on a 30-degree pitch. So that's just the assumption as to how the photovoltaics in the notional dwelling have been provided, and what their performance then would be. There are then, of course, new limiting fabric standards, and that's discussed in detail in the document. Again, you've got this area about this issue about a whole building approach currently being permitted, offsetting these things in Northern Ireland and in the Republic. So whereas there's no option for that kind of trade-off under the approach in the non-domestic side in the limiting standards in England. Adopting England standards on this would reduce the current flexibility offered by the whole building assessment approach, but it would ensure that no one fabric element can be of particularly poor performance. And the key kind of thing in real terms actually is how quickly can we just adopt this software? If we make changes to try and continue with the current limiting installation values and U values and things that we have, it could delay us actually just getting on with it, really. Whereas if we can follow England, we can move more quickly. Air permeability requirements are looked at. Again, we're interested in trying to explore if you could go better than England and Wales's 8 cubic meters per hour per square meter, 50 Pascal limit. So they're saying you can't be any worse than that. We're wondering if we ask a question if we could go down to 5, and that would keep us in line with the Republic of Ireland. Again, the issue there is whether the assurances on ventilation systems and things will deliver, but we think that in non-domestic settings, there's likely to be more professional involvement and oversight and commissioning in those circumstances. And so in non-domestic scenarios, we're wondering if 5 would be appropriate, whereas in the dwelling side, I think we were looking at 6 and 7, something like that, as potential limits, because it's perhaps a little less oversight of the systems is currently occurring, whether that's right or wrong, whether that's a good thing or not. Limiting services standards are outlined in, I think it's in Annex E in our document, and we still have this expectation of 55-degree operating, so you're looking at low temperature systems. The other kind of key change is that the guidance would be brought into the technical booklet guidance, so you wouldn't have a separate non-domestic building services compliance guide, again, similar to the dwelling side. So Annex E outlines these changes. The figures in brackets here on the right-hand side are the current standards that are the limiting performances. So you can see modest improvements here in a range of areas, but it's been a while since our limits were uplifted. So we don't envisage that there's anything there that's terribly challenging. But if there were to be, now's a really good time to try and let us know if you're involved in provision of some of these services and finding that it's really, really difficult to meet this minimum requirement in other regions, or if something is jumping out at you there, that's some kind of tipping point or threshold in a system. We'd be interested to know about it in the feedback to the consultation. There's some new guidance about BACS, building automation and control systems. So you require these building management systems in certain scenarios, and there's a question about whether that should apply at 290 kilowatts or 180 kilowatts. It stems from an EU requirement, a requirement from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that hadn't yet been implemented, and and this would be the building regulations bit of it for when work is being done. There are also, and this is a significant aspect actually, a significant enough thing. So there are additional reporting requirements have been introduced in England, whereby more precise kind of dynamic simulation modelling or a more precise annual forecast of energy use by fuel type, where a building has a useful total floor area of more than 1,000 square meters. So that's an explanation that requires more review and another remodeling exercise beyond just the NCM to try and give your client an accurate depiction of where they really think it's going to go, as opposed to just demonstrating compliance with the building regulations. So we think that could be, we're interested to find out if it could be a relatively onerous requirement. Scotland has a different assessment. It has a requirement on direct emissions heating, which it talks about. So direct emissions heating is any heating where combustion is taking place on the site and there are emissions coming out from that combustion on the site. So Scotland is asking for an explanation as to how you're going to convert this building in the future to a direct emissions heating scenario, and that report is part of the submission. So you would need to provide that along with your proposal. So we're interested as to whether that would be a appropriate thing. Our concern on direct emissions heating would be that hybrid boilers would not fulfill the requirements of direct emissions heating because they're still combusting some fuel on site, even if it's a very small amount. So we're not all, and hybrid boilers, could be a significant or helpful transition route. So that's something that needs consideration on that side of things. My word, I can't believe I've actually managed to get through all that. So and we've got five or 10 minutes here. If anyone has managed to